Levinia Fisher is often cited in urban legends as the first female serial killer in the United States. However, she and her husband, John Fisher, were actually convicted of highway robbery, a capital offense at the time, rather than murder. Fisher and her husband spent most of their lives in Charleston, South Carolina, where they ran an inn called the 6 Mile Wayfarer House in the early 19th century. Located 6 miles north of Charleston, the inn's name reflected its distance from the city. During their time managing the inn, there were reports to the local sheriff about guests going missing. However, due to insufficient evidence and the couple's popularity with locals, these complaints were largely ignored. Levinia Fisher would invite solitary travelers to dinner at the 6 Mile Wayfarer House and question them about their occupations to determine if they had money. She would then send them to their rooms with a cup of poisoned tea. After the men drank the tea and went to bed, her husband would enter the room and beat them nearly to death. Another version of the legend suggests that the tea would only make the men sleep for a few hours. As they were drifting off, Levinia would pull a lever to make the bed collapse and drop them into a pit below. Over time, the details of the alleged crimes committed by John and Levinia Fisher have become heavily exaggerated, making it difficult to discern the truth. However, contemporary reports from the Charleston Post and Courier indicate that a vigilante group visited the Fishers' neighborhood in February of 1819 to confront the supposed gang activities. After they believed their mission was accomplished, the group returned to Charleston, leaving a young man named David Ross to keep watch. Early the next morning, Ross was attacked by 2 men and brought before the gang, which included Levinia Fisher. Instead of helping, Levinia choked him and smashed his head through a window. Ross managed to escape and quickly informed the authorities. Shortly after, another traveler named John Peoples inquired about vacancies. Levinia told him there were none, but invited him to rest and have some tea. Disliking tea, Peoples discreetly dumped it when she wasn't looking. Levinia interrogated him for hours, and eventually told him that a room was available. Suspicious of the interrogation and concerned about being robbed, Peoples decided to sleep in a wooden chair by the door. In the middle of the night, he heard the bed collapse and realized the Fishers' plan. He escaped through the window and rode to Charleston to alert the authorities. These incidents led to the identification of the Fishers and their accomplices. Police were dispatched and during the investigation located Levinia, John, and 2 other gang members. John Fisher surrendered the group in an attempt to protect his wife from potential gunfire, and later provided the names of all involved in the gang during interrogation. Nearly a year passed between the Fishers' arrest and their execution. At their arraignment, Levinia and John Fisher pleaded not guilty, but were ordered to remain in jail until their trial in May, while their co-conspirators were released on bail. During the trial, the jury found the Fishers guilty of highway robbery, a capital offense. Despite their conviction, the judge granted an appeal, giving them a reprieve until the January court session. During this time, the Fishers, housed together in a 6x8 cell at the Old City Jail in Charleston, South Carolina, began plotting their escape. On September 13th, they attempted to flee using a rope made from prison linens. However, the rope broke, leaving Levinia trapped while John managed to escape. Unwilling to continue alone, John was soon recaptured, and both were placed under much stricter security. The Constitutional Court later rejected their appeals, and on February 4, 1820, both were sentenced to hang. While awaiting execution, John sought guidance from Reverend Richard Furman, a local minister, but Lavinia's demeanor became increasingly hostile. On the day of their execution, Reverend Furman read aloud a letter from John Fisher on the gallows before the Old City Jail. In the letter, John claimed that, having become a Christian, he could not accept being executed under false charges. He declared his innocence and asked for mercy for those who wronged him during the judicial process. Following the reading, John addressed the crowd of about 2,000, pleading for their forgiveness, before he was hanged. Lucrecia Winslow was born around 1788 in Bear Plains, Massachusetts. While little is known about her early family life, it was later reported that her branch of the Winslow family was notorious for counterfeiting and related offenses. Her father, Thomas Winslow, was a renowned counterfeiter, and there was speculation that Lucrecia assisted him in his crimes. In her early 20s, Lucrecia moved to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where she worked as a teacher at Madame Lebrun's ladies' school. In 1818, at about 30 years old, Lucrecia married Dr. William Chapman, an Englishman in his 50s. The couple settled in Andalusia, Pennsylvania, and had 5 children together: Mary, William Jr., Lucrecia, John, and Abby Ann. The Chapmans operated the Andalusia boarding school, focusing on curing students of speech issues like stuttering. Lucrecia taught reading, writing, and comportment at the school. On May 9, 1831, Lino Amalia Espos y Mina arrived at the Chapman residence seeking shelter for the night. A witness reported that Dr. Chapman suggested Mina go to a local tavern, but Lucrecia Winslow offered him a room in the house. Winslow and Mina quickly grew close. Neighbors observed them spending a lot of time together and even described their interactions as compromising. On June 19, 1831, Winslow called for a local physician, Dr. Phillips, to examine Dr. Chapman, who had fallen ill 2 days earlier. Dr. Phillips diagnosed Chapman with cholera morbus, a serious but typically non-fatal illness, which was common at the time. He prescribed a light diet, but the symptoms persisted. Dr. Chapman died on June 23, 1831, at his home. 2 weeks after Dr. Chapman's funeral, Lucrecia Chapman and Lino Amalia Espos y Mina were discreetly married in New York City. On the same day, they went their separate ways. Mina returned to Pennsylvania, reportedly for business, while Lucrecia went to Schenectady, New York, to stay with her sister. During their time apart, they frequently corresponded through letters. Eventually, Lucrecia began receiving charges for meals and hotel rooms under Mina's name, indicating he had been staying with several female companions. In a letter to Mina, she confronted him about his misdeeds and lies, concluding with, "But no, Lino. When I pause for a moment, I am constrained to acknowledge that I do not believe that God will permit either you or me to be happy this side of the grave." In October of 1831, Dr. Chapman's body was exhumed for an autopsy. Dr. Mitchell and Mr. Clemson, 2 chemists, assisted in the examination and determined that arsenic was present in Dr. Chapman's body at the time of his death, using resources available to them. Investigators discovered that Mina had purchased arsenic in Philadelphia on June 16, 1831, 1 day before Dr. Chapman became ill. Although Mina made the purchase, witnesses claimed that Lucrecia was with him. Winslow was not in Andalusia when the investigation began, and a reward was issued for her arrest, $150 if found within the state and $300 if found further away. In November, the Philadelphia High Constable Blaney pursued Winslow and located her in Erie County, New York, where she was arrested. On December 5th, Winslow was transferred from the prison in Erie to Doylestown, Pennsylvania, for the trial. Winslow was charged with committing murder. The formal charges against her were being principal in the first degree, indicated as principal in the first degree, and charged as principal in the first degree. She was accused of murdering her husband by putting arsenic in his chicken soup. Winslow pled not guilty to all charges. She approached David Paul Brown, a highly regarded criminal lawyer, about representing her. Believing he could convince a jury of her innocence, he accepted and recruited fellow attorney Peter McCall to assist. There was much debate over how the prosecution of Winslow and Mina would be held, but ultimately the court decided to hold separate trials for each. Winslow was the first to go on trial, starting on February 14, 1832, at the Doylestown Courthouse, overseen by Judge John Fox. The case attracted national attention, and the trial was highly attended. Each day, the courtroom was filled to capacity with press and spectators. Several witnesses were called, including a former student, Mary Palthorpe, and Chapman's former housekeeper, Ellen Shaw. Both spoke of the scandalous nature of Winslow's relationship with Mina, and how the two would often go off to be alone together. The Chapmans' part-time house cleaner, Anne Bantam, testified that Winslow had made the chicken soup for the ailing Dr. Chapman, but did not see her add anything unusual. Dr. Phillips testified about his original diagnosis of cholera morbus and his uncertainty that arsenic was the definitive cause of illness. In total, 26 witnesses were called. During his defense, Brown argued that Winslow had been another one of Mina's victims. Winslow had not purchased the arsenic, and after their marriage, Mina sold most of Winslow's belongings. By the third day of the trial, public opinion began to shift in Winslow's favor. She was seen crying in the courtroom as details of Dr. Chapman's suffering and death were discussed. On February 25th, the jury rendered a verdict of not guilty after 2 hours of deliberation. Many speculated that Winslow was just as guilty as Mina, who was sentenced to death, but the jury was hesitant to hang a woman. There was also a certain level of sympathy for Winslow due to Mina's abandonment of her after their marriage. Frankie Silver was born Frances Stewart, the daughter of Isaiah and Barbara Stewart. When Frankie was young, around 1820, the family moved to Burke County. They settled in the town of Kona, near the home of Jacob Silver, whose wife, Elizabeth, had died in childbirth. Jacob's son, Charlie Silver, was a year older than Frankie. Charlie and Frankie eventually married and initially seemed well matched. On November 3, 1830, their first daughter, Nancy, was born. The couple lived in a wooden cabin on land given to them by Jacob Silver. During Christmas of 1831, Charlie Silver went missing while out hunting. Despite a search party's efforts, he could not be found. In January of 1832, Jack Collis decided to investigate while Frankie was in the village. He discovered bones in the fireplace and bloodstains on the floor, prompting him to call the sheriff. Further investigation revealed a head. It was determined that on December 22, 1831, Charlie Silver, also known as Johnny Silver, had been hacked to death with an axe and dismembered in the cabin he shared with his wife, Frankie, and their 13-month-old daughter, Nancy. The investigation uncovered a fireplace filled with oily ashes, a pool of blood that had seeped through the cabin's puncheon floor, and blood spatters on the walls. Pieces of bone and flesh were found in ashes poured into a mortar hole near the spring, along with a heel iron, similar to those worn by Charlie on his hunting moccasins. According to Silver family lore, the evidence indicated that Charlie had been murdered and his body burned to conceal the crime. Shortly after the murder, suspicion fell on Charlie's wife Frankie, her mother Barbara Stewart, and her brother Jackson Blackstone Stewart. All three were arrested. On January 17, 1832, Barbara and Blackstone Stewart pled not guilty before a magistrate and were discharged. Frankie alone stood trial for the murder. The motive for the murder remains unclear. During the trial, it was claimed that Frankie was a jealous wife seeking revenge. Later theories suggest that she was an abused wife. However, there is no definitive evidence supporting either theory. Despite claims made by journalists at the time, Frankie never confessed or discussed her motives. One theory posits that Frankie wanted to move west with her parents to join other family members, but Charlie refused. It was speculated that her frustration with Charlie's refusal was the motive for the murder. Frankie's trial began on March 29, 1832. Initially, the jury was undecided, but after receiving further instructions, they reconvened and found Frankie guilty. Between her sentencing and hanging, Frankie was broken out of jail by someone who entered through one of the basement windows. Using a false key, this person unlocked the doors leading to her cell. 7 days later, Frankie was arrested again in Henderson County. She was found walking behind her father's wagon, heading for Tennessee. When apprehended, she was dressed in men's clothes, and her hair had been cut short. Her father and uncle were also jailed as accessories to her escape. Frankie was hanged in Morganton, North Carolina, on Friday, July 12, 1833. Her father had planned to bring her body home and bury it in the family plot. However, the extreme heat and humidity in North Carolina that year forced him to bury her in an unmarked grave behind the Buckhorn Tavern, a few miles west of Morganton. For many years, the exact location of the grave was unknown, but it is now believed to be in a remote corner of the present-day DeVault Farm. In 1952, Beatrice Cobb, editor of the Morganton newspaper, placed a granite stone marking on the probable location of the grave. The marker, however, misspells Frankie's married name as Silvers. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button to join our community. We upload every Monday and Thursday at 4 p.m. For more content like this, be sure to check out our other videos on the channel. You can also follow us on our other social media platforms for uploads and updates. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.